Chapter 1. Sent Away. I was only 6 years old, and I was worried. I sat behind our hogan, leaning against its familiar walls and looking up toward the mesa. I hoped I would see an eagle, for that would be a good sign. I also hoped I wouldn't hear anyone call my name, for that would be a sign of something else entirely. But the eagle didn't appear. Instead, my mother's voice, not much louder than a whisper, broke the silence. "Kieja, come. Your uncle is in the wagon." The moment I dreaded had arrived. I stood and looked toward the hills. I could run up there and hide. But I didn't do so, for I had always obeyed my mother, whose love for me was as certain as the firmness of the sacred earth beneath my moccasins. However, I did drag my feet as I came up from behind our hogan to see what I knew I would see. There stood my tall, beautiful mother. Her thick black hair was tied up into a bun. She was dressed in her finest clothing, a new silky blue blouse and a blue pleated skirt decorated with bands of gold ribbons. On her feet were soft calf-high moccasins, and she wore all her silver and turquoise jewelry, her squash blossom necklace, her bracelets, her concha belt, her earrings. I knew she had adorned herself with all of these things for me. She wanted me to have this image of her to keep in my mind, to be with me when I was far from home. However, the thing I saw most clearly was what she held in her arms. It was a small bundle of my clothes tied in a blanket. My heart sank. I really was going to be sent away. My mother motioned toward the door of our hogan, and I went inside. My great-grandfather was waiting for me on his bed. He was too weak to walk, and he was so old that he had shrunk in size. He had never been a big man, but now he was almost as small as me. Great-grandfather took my hand in both of his. "Be strong, Kieja," he rasped, his voice as creaky as an old saddle. I stood up on my toes so that I could put my arms around his neck, and then pressed my cheek against his leathery face. "Kieja," he said again, patting my back. "Our dear little boy." I had always been small for my age. My father used to tease me about it, saying that when I was born, he made my cradle board out of the handle of a wooden spoon. My baby name was Aweyeja, little baby. Little I was, and little I stayed. I went from being Aweyeja, little baby, to Kieja, little boy. "You are small," my great-grandfather said, as if he could hear what I was thinking. "But your heart is large. You will do your best." I nodded. When I stepped outside, my mother bent down and embraced me much harder than my grandfather had hugged me. Then she stepped back to stand by the door of our hogan. "Travel safely, my son," Mother said. Her voice was so sad. My father came up to me and put his broad, calloused hands on my shoulders. He too was wearing his best clothing and jewelry. Though he said nothing, I think Father was even sadder than my mother, so sad that words failed him. He was shorter than her, but he was very strong, and always stood so straight that he seemed tall as a lodgepole pine to me. His eyes were moist as he lifted me up to the wagon seat, and then nodded. My uncle clucked to the horses and shook the reins. The wagon lurched forward. As I grabbed the wooden backboard to steady myself, I felt a splinter go into my finger from the roughed wood. But I ignored the pain. Instead, I pulled myself around to turn backward and wave to my parents. I kept waving.